The ancient floorboards of St. Catherine's groaned under Father Thomas Brennan's weight as he climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. Each step released the scent of decades-old wood polish and the lingering dampness that seemed to permeate every corner of the orphanage. Sister Margaret led the way, her heavy breathing echoing in the cramped stairwell, her usual composure fractured by whatever she'd discovered in the morning hours. "She's never shown any artistic inclination before," Sister Margaret whispered, pausing at the door. 11 years, Father, 11 years of silence, and now this." The door creaked open to reveal a space that shouldn't have existed in the practical world of St. Catherine's. Sunlight streamed through a small dormer window, illuminating what could only be described as a shrine. Dozens of sketches covered every available surface, tacked to the slanted walls, spread across the floor, some still curled from where they'd been hastily torn from a sketchbook. The Virgin Mary gazed out from each drawing, but these weren't the sanitized images from church pamphlets. These portraits pulsed with life, each fold of fabric rendered with impossible precision, each expression subtly different yet unmistakably divine. Father Brennan knelt beside one of the drawings, careful not to disturb the arrangement. The paper was cheap, the kind distributed in the orphanage's makeshift classroom, but the artistry transcended its humble medium. This wasn't the work of an untrained teenager. The shading techniques, the understanding of light and shadow, the delicate way the figure's hands were positioned, it spoke of years of study, of classical training that simply didn't exist in rural Montana. "Where is she now?" he asked, studying the strange markings beneath each image. The letters were unfamiliar, yet somehow familiar, as if he'd encountered them in half-remembered dreams. "In the kitchen, helping with breakfast preparations." "She doesn't know I've brought you up here." Sister Margaret wrung her hands, a gesture that seemed foreign to her usually steady demeanor. "Father, those words, I've been praying over them all morning. They feel sacred, but I can't understand a single symbol." Brennan lifted another sketch, this one showing Mary with tears streaming down her face. The expression was so heartbreakingly human that he felt his chest tighten. Below the image, more of the mysterious script flowed across the paper in elegant strokes. His seminary training had included brief exposure to ancient languages, Hebrew, some Greek, fragments of Latin variations, but this was something else entirely. "How long has she been drawing these?" "I found them this morning when I came to check her window latch. The storm last night was fierce, and her room gets the worst of the wind." Sister Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But Father, I don't think these were drawn last night. The paper, some of it looks older. As if she's been creating them for weeks, maybe months, and hiding them somehow." The implication sent a chill through Brennan that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. In his 15 years investigating alleged miracles and supernatural occurrences for the diocese, he'd encountered every variety of fraud, delusion, and genuine mystery the human experience could produce. But this felt different. The careful arrangement of the drawings, the consistent quality of the artwork, the presence of a written language that seemed to exist outside known linguistic traditions, it suggested a level of sophistication that didn't align with a teenage girl's cry for attention. He moved toward the window, where the light revealed additional details in the sketches. Some showed Mary against backgrounds that looked distinctly like the Montana landscape, rolling hills dotted with pine trees, a distinctive rock formation he recognized from his drive to the orphanage. Others depicted her in spaces that seemed to exist nowhere on Earth, surrounded by swirling patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Sister, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." Brennan turned from the window, studying the nun's weathered face. "Has Mariel shown any other unusual behaviors recently? Changes in her routine, places she's been found where she shouldn't be, anything that might suggest—" "That might suggest what, Father?" He gestured to encompass the extraordinary collection surrounding them. "That someone else is involved, that she's receiving instruction or materials or—" He let the sentence hang, unwilling to voice the darker possibilities that his experience had taught him to consider. Sister Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze traveling across the drawings with something approaching reverence. "Father, In all my years here, Mariel has been the most predictable child we've housed. She wakes before dawn, helps in the kitchen, attends lessons, reads in the library, and retires early. She speaks to no one because she can't, and no one speaks to her about anything more complex than daily tasks. If someone were teaching her, training her, influencing her, I would know. The certainty in her voice was absolute, but Brennan had learned that absolute certainty was often the first casualty of genuine mystery. Somewhere in the rooms below, a silent girl was going about her morning routine, unaware that her secret had been discovered. The real investigation was about to begin. The kitchen of St. Catherine's hummed with the quiet efficiency of morning routines when Father Brennan first laid eyes on Mariel Santos. She stood at the industrial sink, her slight frame dwarfed by the institutional fixtures, methodically washing dishes with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed. Her dark hair hung in a simple braid down her back, and she wore the same grey wool dress as the other girls, but something about her stillness set her apart, as if she existed in a pocket of silence, even within the already hushed atmosphere of the orphanage. Sister Margaret approached the girl with careful steps, her usual briskness softened to something approaching tenderness. Mariel, dear, I'd like you to meet Father Brennan. He's visiting us from Helena." The girl turned slowly, and Brennan found himself looking into eyes that seemed far older than 17 years should allow. They were dark brown, almost black, and held a depth of awareness that made him unexpectedly uncomfortable. When her gaze met his, there was no shyness, no curiosity, only a careful assessment that reminded him more of a wild animal gauging threat than a teenager meeting a stranger. Mariel nodded once, a precise gesture that managed to convey both acknowledgement and dismissal. She dried her hands on a threadbare towel and returned to her work without a sound. Her movements had an economy born of years of routine: stack the clean plates in perfect rows, arrange the utensils by size and type, wipe down the counter with systematic strokes that eliminated every trace of moisture. "She's been like this since she arrived," Sister Margaret murmured, positioning herself so that Mariel couldn't see her lips. The trauma of the accident. It took her voice, but it also gave her this incredible attention to detail. She notices everything, every crack in the wall, every change in routine, every mood shift among the other children. Sometimes I think she sees more clearly than any of us. Brennan watched the girl work, noting how she seemed to exist in perfect harmony with her environment. The kitchen was clearly her domain. She moved through it without conscious thought, knowing exactly where each item belonged, anticipating the needs of the meal preparation that would follow. There was something almost meditative about her presence, as if the simple act of performing these daily tasks provided her with a form of peace that words never could. Other girls began filtering into the kitchen, their chatter creating a gentle buzz of activity. They moved around Mariel with practiced ease, including her in their routines without expecting participation. A younger girl with freckles touched Mariel's shoulder briefly while reaching for a pot, and Mariel responded by shifting slightly to give her better access, a wordless communication that spoke of deep familiarity. "She takes care of them," Sister Margaret continued, her voice carrying notes of both admiration and concern. "The younger ones especially. When someone has a nightmare, Mariel appears at their bedside before any of us even wake. When a child is homesick or frightened, they seek her out instead of the sisters. She has no words to comfort them, but somehow her presence is enough." Brennan could see what the nun meant. Despite her silence, Mariel seemed to anchor the entire room. The other girls moved with more confidence when she was near. Their laughter came easier, their small anxieties seemed to fade. She had become their guardian angel without ever speaking a word of comfort. But as he watched more closely, Brennan began to notice the subtle signs of strain that Sister Margaret either missed or chose to ignore. The way Mariel's shoulders tensed when too many people crowded around her, the slight tremor in her hands during moments of stillness, the way her gaze would sometimes drift to the windows with an expression that suggested she was seeing something far beyond the Montana landscape. When the breakfast preparations were complete, and the other girls had moved to the dining hall, Mariel lingered in the kitchen. She cleaned surfaces that were already spotless, reorganized supplies that needed no reorganization. Her movements had lost their earlier fluidity and taken on something almost compulsive, as if the act of controlling her immediate environment was the only thing standing between her and some form of chaos. Sister Margaret approached her again, this time carrying a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Mariel, I brought you some new drawing supplies. Your old sketchbook was getting rather full." The transformation in the girl was immediate and startling. Her entire body went rigid, and her eyes flew to Sister Margaret's face with unmistakable alarm. For just a moment, her careful composure cracked, and Brennan caught a glimpse of something that looked remarkably like guilt. The bundle trembled slightly in Sister Margaret's hands. "I know you enjoy sketching in your free time. There's nothing wrong with that, dear. Art can be a wonderful form of prayer." Mariel took the supplies with movements that seemed mechanical, her earlier grace replaced by the careful control of someone trying very hard not to run. She clutched the bundle against her chest and headed toward the door, but not before Brennan caught the expression that crossed her face, a mixture of gratitude and terror that suggested her secret world was far more complex than anyone had realized. As she disappeared into the corridor, Brennan found himself wondering what drove a silent girl to create impossible art in the darkness of her attic room, and why the discovery of her talent seemed to frighten her more than anything else. The afternoon light was fading when the first car arrived. Father Brennan looked up from his examination of the mysterious script, squinting through Mariel's small attic window at the unfamiliar sedan pulling into St. Catherine's gravel driveway. The vehicle was expensive, too expensive for this remote corner of Montana, its black paint gleaming despite the dust from the mountain roads. A second car followed, then a third, their occupants remaining seated as if waiting for some predetermined signal. "Sister Margaret!" Brennan called down the narrow staircase, his voice carrying an urgency he couldn't quite suppress. "Are you expecting visitors?" The nun's footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs, followed by her sharp intake of breath as she peered over his shoulder at the growing procession below. "No, Father. We never receive visitors without advance notice. The roads out here, people don't simply stumble upon St. Catherine's." But they were arriving anyway. By the time Sister Margaret reached the main floor, 7 vehicles had arranged themselves in the orphanage, small parking area with military precision. Men in dark coats emerged first, not clergy, but something else entirely. Their movements held the practiced alertness of people accustomed to handling delicate situations. Government, perhaps, or church officials from higher up the hierarchy than Brennan had anticipated. The front door's heavy knocker echoed through the building with the finality of judgment itself. Brennan descended the attic stairs, 3 at a time, the sketches he'd been studying still clutched in his hand. In the main corridor, he could hear Sister Margaret's measured footsteps approaching the entrance, but something in the orchestrated nature of this arrival made him want to reach her first. His 15 years investigating supernatural claims had taught him to recognize the difference between inquiry and intervention, and this felt distinctly like the latter. "Sister, wait!" he called, but she had already opened the door. The man standing on the threshold was tall and gaunt, his silver hair combed with the kind of precision that suggested either vanity or military training. His coat was expensive but practical, and his eyes held the flat assessment of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Sister Margaret, I presume. I am Monsignor Harrison from the Helena Diocese. We need to speak immediately about one of your charges, a girl named Mariel Santos." Behind Harrison, other figures remained in the shadows of the late afternoon, but Brennan could sense their presence like a physical weight. This wasn't the careful, methodical investigation he'd been conducting. This was something else entirely, swift, decisive, and deeply unsettling. Sister Margaret's composure never wavered, but Brennan caught the slight stiffening of her shoulders. "Of course, Monsignor. Though I should mention that Father Brennan is already here investigating. Father Brennan's preliminary work has been noted." Harrison's gaze shifted to Brennan with the kind of dismissal that suggested his involvement was now redundant. However, new information has come to light that requires a more specialized response. The words sent ice through Brennan's veins. New information. In his experience, that phrase usually meant someone had made connections that others preferred remain hidden. He thought of the sketches upstairs, of the impossible artistry and unknown language, of the careful way Mariel had reacted to Sister Margaret's mention of her drawing. What kind of specialized response? Brennan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Harrison's smile was thin and administrative. The church has facilities better equipped to handle cases of psychological complexity. Young Miss Santos will receive excellent care, and the situation here can return to normal. It was then that Brennan realized they weren't alone in the corridor. Mariel stood at the far end of the hallway, partially hidden in the shadows near the kitchen door. How long had she been there? Her face was pale but composed, and in her dark eyes was something Brennan hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly, but the terrible clarity of someone who understood that a moment of choice had arrived. The girl stepped forward into the light, still clutching the bundle of drawing supplies Sister Margaret had given her. She looked first at the imposing figure of Monsignor Harrison, then at Brennan, and finally at Sister Margaret. Her silence had always been her refuge, but now it seemed like a weapon she wasn't sure how to use. Harrison noticed her presence, and his expression softened into something that might have been paternal concern if it had reached his eyes. "Mariel, dear child, we're here to help you. The church has wonderful facilities where you can receive proper care for your condition." The girl's grip on the art supplies tightened until her knuckles went white. For 11 years she had lived in the safety of silence, hidden in routines and shadows. But the drawings upstairs had changed everything, and now forces beyond her control were moving to reshape her world. Brennan watched her face and saw the exact moment when Mariel Santos realized that her silence could no longer protect her. Whatever was coming next, she would have to choose, surrender to their plans, or find another way to speak her truth. The choice would define everything that followed. Mariel's fingers loosened on the art supplies, and for a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, the bundle wavered between falling and being saved. She caught it at the last second, but the near miss felt prophetic. Everything she had carefully held together for 11 years was slipping away just as suddenly. The silence that had been her sanctuary now felt like quicksand. Every eye in the corridor was upon her, waiting for some response she couldn't give, some capitulation she wasn't sure she could make. Monsignor Harrison's kind words carried the undertone of inevitability that adults used when they'd already decided your fate. She had heard it before, in hospital corridors when they'd explained why she couldn't speak anymore, in social workers' offices when they'd arranged her placement, at St. Catherine's, in countless moments when her life had been reshaped without her consent. But this time felt different. This time she had something to lose beyond just routine and familiarity. Her gaze drifted upward, toward the ceiling that separated the main floor from her attic sanctuary. Above them, scattered across her small desk and hidden beneath loose floorboards, lay dozens of drawings that had poured from her hands like water from a broken dam. The Virgin Mary's face, rendered again and again with desperate precision, the strange script that flowed from her pencil without conscious thought, the visions that came in the dark hours before dawn, so vivid and insistent that she couldn't rest until she'd captured them on paper. They couldn't know about the messages, not the real ones, not the way Mary's lips sometimes moved in the drawings, forming words in languages that predated anything Mariel had ever learned. Not the way her own hand cramped from drawing symbols that felt ancient and urgent, as if something vital would be lost forever if she didn't get them exactly right. The art supplies grew heavier in her arms. Sister Margaret had given them to her this morning with such innocent kindness, not knowing she was providing the tools for something that went far beyond hobby sketching. If Mariel left St. Catherine's now, if they took her to one of those facilities where everything was monitored and controlled, when would she draw again? When would she be alone in the dark hours when the visions came strongest? What if the messages stopped? The thought struck her like physical pain. For weeks now, the drawings had been her only connection to something larger than the grey routine of orphanage life. In those moments when her pencil moved without conscious direction, she felt less alone than she had since the night her parents died. The Virgin Mary in her sketches didn't speak in words Mariel could understand, but her presence felt more real than anything in the waking world. "Child?" Monsignor Harrison's voice had taken on a sharper edge beneath its veneer of patience. "I know this must be overwhelming, but the sooner we address your condition, the better." Condition. The word sat in her mind like a stone. They saw her silence as something broken that needed fixing, her art as a symptom of psychological distress. They couldn't comprehend that her inability to speak had become the very thing that allowed her to hear something else entirely. Mariel looked at Father Brennan, searching his face for some sign of understanding. He had examined her drawings with the careful attention of someone who recognized significance rather than pathology. But even he seemed uncertain now, caught between his own investigation and this sudden intervention from higher authority. Behind the assembled adults, she could see other girls from the orphanage peering around doorframes, their faces reflecting the same anxiety that churned in her stomach. Sarah, barely 8 years old, who still crawled into Mariel's bed during thunderstorms. Emily, who had stopped eating when she'd first arrived, until Mariel had sat beside her at every meal, not speaking but simply present. They had grown to depend on her constancy, her silent reliability in a world where adults regularly disappeared from their lives. If she left, who would comfort them? Who would notice when they were struggling and appear at their bedsides in the dark hours? Her role here wasn't just about existing in careful routines, it was about being the steady presence that others could anchor themselves to. But the drawings demanded something different. They pulled at her with increasing urgency, as if whatever force guided her hand was running out of time. She could feel the weight of unfinished visions, incomplete messages, symbols that needed to be captured before they faded from her memory like dreams at sunrise. The choice before her wasn't just about staying or going, it was about which version of herself she was willing to sacrifice, the guardian angel the other girls needed, or the vessel for something sacred and mysterious that she barely understood but couldn't bear to lose. Mariel Santos had spent 11 years learning to exist in the spaces between words, finding meaning in silence and safety in invisible routines. Now, with forces beyond her control closing in from all directions, she realized that silence itself might not be enough to protect what mattered most. The drawing supplies trembled in her arms as she finally understood the true weight of the choice before her. The bundle slipped from Mariel's arms. It wasn't an accident, not the fumbling near miss of moments before, but a deliberate release. The brown paper split against the wooden floor, sending pencils rolling across the worn boards like scattered bones, sheets of fresh paper fanning out in a mockery of angel wings. The sound echoed through the corridor with surprising finality. Monsignor Harrison's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Careful, child. Those supplies are—" Mariel turned and ran. Not the careful, measured steps she had perfected over 11 years of invisible existence, but a headlong sprint that sent her dark hair streaming behind her like a battle flag. Her feet knew every creaking board, every uneven surface in St. Catherine's maze of corridors. Behind her, she heard the sharp intake of breath, the shuffle of expensive shoes on old wood, Father Brennan's voice calling her name with something that might have been warning or encouragement. She took the attic stairs 3 at a time, her heart hammering against her ribs. The narrow passage that had always felt like a refuge now seemed like a trap. One way up, one way down, and men in dark coats controlling the only exit. But she wasn't thinking about escape routes. She was thinking about the drawings. Her small room was exactly as she'd left it. Bed neatly made, few possessions arranged with careful precision. But now everything looked different, contaminated by the knowledge that strangers had been here, examining her most private creations with clinical detachment. The loose floorboard near her desk had been replaced correctly, but not quite perfectly. They knew about her hiding place. Footsteps thundered up the stairs behind her, but Mariel was already moving. She dropped to her knees and pried up the board, her fingernails scraping against wood as she pulled out the wrapped bundle of her secret work. Dozens of drawings, some barely more than sketches, others rendered with obsessive detail. The Virgin Mary's face stared up at her from the topmost page, serene, knowing, urgent. Mariel. Father Brennan appeared in her doorway, breathing hard. Behind him she could hear Monsignor Harrison's measured assent, unhurried now that his quarry was cornered. "Please, let's talk about this." She clutched the drawings against her chest and shook her head violently. How could she explain what they didn't understand? That these weren't symptoms of psychological distress, but communications from something beyond her comprehension. That the strange script flowing from her pencil felt more real than any words she'd ever spoken. That losing these visions would be like losing her parents all over again, a severing from the only thing that made her feel connected to purpose larger than mere survival. The sound of multiple footsteps filled the narrow stairway now. They were coming for her, these officials with their kind words and predetermined solutions. In moments, they would take her drawings as evidence, catalogue them as symptoms, use them to justify whatever treatment they deemed necessary. The thought was unbearable. Mariel looked toward her small window, where the Montana landscape stretched endlessly toward mountains that caught the dying light. For 11 years, she had lived within the careful boundaries of St. Catherine's, finding safety in routine and predictability. The world beyond these walls was vast and unknown, full of dangers she couldn't anticipate or prepare for. But the drawings in her arms seemed to pulse with their own urgency, as if the force that guided her hand was making its own choice clear. She couldn't protect the visions by surrendering to those who saw them as pathology. She couldn't preserve something sacred by allowing it to be dissected by those who didn't believe in its reality. Monsignor Harrison's silver head appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression shifting from administrative patience to sharp concern as he took in the scene, the scattered contents of her hiding place, the desperate way she held her drawings, the wild look in her eyes that suggested flight rather than submission. "Now, Mariel," he said, his voice taking on the careful modulation adults used with dangerous animals. "No one wants to hurt you. We simply need to understand what's been happening here." She backed toward the window, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Understanding. They wanted to understand something that existed beyond the realm of their clinical vocabulary, something that could only be experienced in the silence between heartbeats, in the dark hours when the boundary between sleeping and waking grew thin. The choice crystallized with sudden clarity. She could surrender, accept their help, their facilities, their treatment, and lose forever the mysterious connection that had given meaning to her voiceless existence. Or she could trust in something larger than her own fear, step beyond the careful boundaries that had protected her for so long, and discover what lay on the other side of silence. Mariel Santos pressed the drawings closer to her heart and made her choice. She opened the window. The window groaned against years of disuse, paint flakes drifting to the floor like snow as Mariel forced it open. The Montana winter bit through her thin sweater with immediate cruelty, but the cold felt like clarity after the suffocating weight of too many eyes, too many expectations pressing down on her small room. "Dear God, Mariel, no!" Father Brennan lunged forward, but she was already climbing onto the narrow sill, her bare feet finding purchase on wood, worn smooth by decades of weather. The drawings remained clutched against her chest with one arm while she gripped the window frame with the other. Below her, the orphanage's steep roof sloped away into gutters thick with ice and accumulated leaves. Beyond that, a two-story drop to the hard-packed earth of the courtyard. It should have been terrifying, would have been, to the careful girl who had spent 11 years avoiding any action that might draw unwanted attention. But the girl perched on the window ledge felt transformed by desperation into something else entirely. Everyone remained calm. Monsignor Harrison's voice cut through the frigid air with administrative authority, but Mariel caught the tension beneath his control. This was not the neat resolution he had planned. "Mariel," You're frightened and acting irrationally. Come down from there." She turned her face toward the wind, letting it whip her dark hair across her cheeks. The setting sun painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the colors she saw sometimes in her visions, warm light that seemed to emanate from the Virgin Mary herself, light that her pencils could never quite capture, no matter how many different techniques she tried. "The roof won't hold your weight," Father Brennan said quietly, extending his hand toward her. "Please, let me help you." For a moment, Mariel almost believed him. There was genuine concern in his voice, something different from the clinical patience of the others. He had studied her drawings with the attention of someone seeking truth rather than symptoms. But behind him, Monsignor Harrison waited with the cold efficiency of institutional power, and she knew that accepting Father Brennan's help would only delay the inevitable. The wind carried sounds from the world beyond St. Catherine's, the distant rumble of a truck on the mountain highway, the bark of a farm dog, the whistle of air through pine boughs heavy with snow. For 11 years, those sounds had been the soundtrack to her contained existence, familiar but forever separate from her daily reality. Now they seemed to be calling her name. "Think of the other girls," Harrison said, his tone shifting to something that might have been genuine appeal. "They look up to you, don't they? Sarah and Emily and the others. What will this teach them about facing their problems?" The words hit her like a physical blow. She could picture Sarah's face when she discovered that Mariel had vanished, the way the younger girl would probably blame herself for not being good enough to make the quiet older girl stay. Emily would stop eating again, retreating into the protective shell that Mariel's steady presence had slowly coaxed her from. All the small connections she had built through silent companionship would be severed, leaving children who already had too little stability with one less constant in their lives. But the drawings pressed against her heart seemed to pulse with their own imperatives. The strange script that flowed from her pencil was becoming more urgent lately, more complex, as if whatever force guided her hand was running out of time to communicate something vital. If she surrendered now, would she ever discover what those symbols meant? Would the visions continue in the sterile environment of a treatment facility, or would they fade like dreams exposed to too much clinical light? "I've seen your artwork," Father Brennan said softly. "It's extraordinary. Whatever you're experiencing, whatever's happening to you, it doesn't have to be pathology. Sometimes the sacred chooses unexpected vessels." His words sent a shock of recognition through her. Sacred. He understood, at least partially, that her drawings were more than teenage fantasy or psychological dysfunction. But understanding and protection were different things, and she could see in his face that even his sympathy wouldn't be enough to shield her from the machinery of institutional intervention that Harrison represented. The roof below her looked increasingly possible. If she could reach the section over the main building, she might be able to work her way down to the kitchen extension, then drop to the woodshed roof and finally to the ground. The older girls sometimes snuck out this way to meet local boys, though none had ever attempted it in winter, in daylight, with half the Catholic hierarchy watching. "Mariel!" Sister Margaret's voice drifted up from the courtyard below. The nun stood in the snow, her habit whipping around her like dark wings, her face upturned with an expression that mixed terror and something else, something that looked almost like pride. "Whatever you choose, child, choose it for yourself, not for us." The words hit Mariel with unexpected force. In all her years at St. Catherine's, she had never heard an adult explicitly grant her permission to defy authority, to prioritize her own needs over institutional expectations. Sister Margaret's weathered face showed genuine anguish, but also a recognition that some choices belonged entirely to the person making them. Mariel looked once more at the drawings in her arms, then at the faces surrounding her. Father Brennan's worried compassion, Monsignor Harrison's barely contained frustration, the distant figure of Sister Margaret waiting in the snow below. She stepped onto the roof. The slate tiles shifted under Mariel's bare feet like broken promises, each step a small avalanche of ice and debris that clattered into the gutters below. The drawings pressed against her chest, seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat as she found her balance on the steep slope, her toes already numb from the cold, but her mind crystalline with purpose. Behind her, Father Brennan's voice carried through the open window, "Dear God, she's actually doing it." The note of incredulous respect beneath his fear told her everything she needed to know about the impossibility of what she'd chosen. But impossible had become her only option. The wind whipped across the exposed roof with vicious intensity, trying to tear the precious bundle from her arms. Mariel adjusted her grip, pressing the drawings tighter against her body as she began her careful descent toward the main building's lower section. Each movement was calculated desperation. Too slow and they would find another way to reach her, too fast and she would join her parents in whatever came after the sudden stop. From the courtyard below, Sister Margaret's voice rose like a prayer. "Careful, child. Test each step." The nun's support gave her strength, but it was Father Brennan's earlier words that echoed in her mind as she navigated the treacherous slope. Sometimes the sacred chooses unexpected vessels. For 11 years, she had thought her silence was a wound that would never heal, a fundamental brokenness that set her apart from the speaking world. But what if it was preparation? What if the visions came to her precisely because she had learned to listen with more than her ears? The kitchen extension loomed ahead, its roof a full story lower than her current position. The gap between buildings yawned like an accusation, 6 feet of empty air over a courtyard filled with stones and frozen earth. The older girls who had made this escape route legendary had always spoken of it as a graceful leap, but they had attempted it from the dormitory side, where the distance was half as far and the consequences of failure significantly less permanent. "Mariel, please." Monsignor Harrison's voice cracked with something that might have been genuine panic. "This is madness." She paused at the roof's edge, looking back toward the window where his silver head was visible in the frame. His face had lost all pretense of administrative calm, revealing something almost human beneath the ecclesiastical authority. For a moment, she wondered if his concern was real, if perhaps he genuinely believed that psychiatric treatment would help her rather than simply eliminate a problem that threatened church stability. But the drawings in her arms seemed to grow heavier, and she remembered the strange urgency that had been building in her visions lately. The Virgin Mary's messages had been growing more complex, more insistent, as if time was running short for whatever communication she was meant to receive. If they took her away now, if they medicated away her ability to slip between sleeping and waking in the dark hours when the visions came strongest, would she ever discover what those ancient symbols truly meant? The sound of doors slamming echoed from below as figures emerged from the orphanage. Harrison must have sent someone to circle around, to be waiting when she reached the ground. The net was tightening with institutional efficiency, but it wasn't closed yet. Mariel backed up 3 steps, measuring the distance with her eyes. The older girls had always said the secret was committing completely. Hesitation meant falling short, and falling short meant consequences that didn't bear thinking about. But she had spent 11 years perfecting hesitation, finding safety in careful consideration of every action's potential ramifications. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from the village chimneys and something else, something that reminded her of the incense that burned during evening prayers, sweet and mysterious and full of promises that couldn't be spoken aloud. It was the same scent that sometimes filled her small room during the deepest visions, when her hand moved across paper with purpose that transcended conscious intention. "Choose for yourself," Sister Margaret had said, "not for the church's comfort, not for institutional convenience, not even for the other girls who depended on her presence." For the first time in 11 years, Mariel Santos was being asked to prioritize her own needs, her own calling, over the careful balance of obligations that had defined her existence. The drawings rustled against her sweater as another gust of wind tried to tear them away. She could see faces pressed against windows throughout the orphanage now, Sarah and Emily and all the others, watching with the fascination that children brought to witnessing the impossible. Perhaps this was its own kind of lesson, that sometimes the most important choice was the one that looked like madness from the outside but felt like flying from within. Mariel took a deep breath, tasted winter and possibility and the metallic tang of her own fear. Then she ran toward the edge of the roof, her bare feet finding purchase on ice-slick slate, the drawings pressed like a promise against her heart, and for one suspended moment between buildings she was weightless, carried by faith alone. The landing was chaos incarnate. Her shoulder struck the kitchen roof with bone-jarring force, sending her tumbling across slate tiles that cracked like gunshots under her weight. The drawings scattered, white pages spinning through the frigid air like wounded birds, and Mariel's silent scream was the sound of 11 years of careful preservation disintegrating in seconds. She lunged desperately after the nearest sketch, her fingernails scraping against ice as she caught one corner of a drawing just before it sailed into the void. The Virgin Mary's serene face stared up at her from the rescued page, somehow untorn despite its violent flight, those dark eyes holding depths that no 17-year-old should have been able to capture with mere graphite and paper. But the others, God, the others, were already dancing on the wind, carried beyond reach by gusts that seemed almost malevolent in their timing. 3 pages caught in the orphanage gutters, their ancient Aramaic script now exposed to eyes that would see only evidence of psychological breakdown. 2 more spiraled toward the courtyard, where Monsignor Harrison's men waited like hunters around a wounded animal. "No, no, no," she whispered, the first words she had attempted to speak in 11 years, and they came out as broken gasps that tasted of copper and despair. Her voice felt foreign in her own throat, rusty from disuse, but terror had finally found something stronger than her carefully maintained silence. The kitchen roof groaned ominously under her weight. Through a skylight glazed with frost, she could see Sister Catherine working at the massive stove, unaware that salvation and destruction were playing out mere feet above her head. The nun's familiar silhouette should have been comforting, but instead it reminded Mariel how completely she had severed herself from the only safety she had ever known. Footsteps thundered through the building below. They were coming, armed with sedatives and institutional authority and the unshakable conviction that they knew what was best for a girl who had spent 11 years proving that the adult world's solutions rarely aligned with a broken child's actual needs. She gathered the few rescued drawings against her chest and scrambled toward the roof's edge, where the woodshed offered her final chance at ground-level escape. The jump to the shed roof was shorter but more treacherous. The wooden shingles were slick with accumulated ice, and the structure swayed visibly under Montana's relentless wind. Mariel landed hard, her knees buckling as the shed shuddered beneath her impact. For a horrifying moment, she thought the entire building might collapse, taking her down in an avalanche of splintered wood and rusty tools. But the shed held, and she half slid, half fell toward its edge, her bare feet now completely numb but still somehow finding purchase on surfaces that should have been impossible to navigate. The final drop to the courtyard loomed ahead, 8 feet of empty air to frozen earth that would either represent freedom or the end of everything she had been trying to protect. "There, kitchen side!" The shout came from behind her, Harrison's voice carrying the sharp edge of institutional authority reasserting itself. She turned to see dark figures emerging from the orphanage's rear entrance, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who had clearly done this before. How many other children had they cornered like this? How many desperate flights had ended with submission disguised as medical necessity? The thought ignited something fierce in her chest, something that had been building through 11 years of careful compliance and grateful silence. These were the same people who had failed to prevent her parents' death, who had processed her grief like paperwork, who had been content to let her fade into voiceless invisibility as long as she didn't disturb their careful routines. But the visions had disturbed everything. The strange script flowing from her pencil, the Virgin Mary's urgent messages, the growing sense that something vast and incomprehensible was trying to communicate through her art, all of it threatened their orderly world where miracles were safely contained within approved theological boundaries. Standing on the shed's edge, clutching the remnants of her secret work against the Montana wind, Mariel finally understood what was truly at stake. This wasn't about her mental health or even her spiritual welfare. This was about power, who controlled the narrative of divine communication, who decided which vessels were acceptable for sacred messages, who determined the difference between genuine mysticism and convenient pathology. The drawings in her arms seemed to pulse with vindication, as if the force that guided her hand was confirming what her conscious mind had finally grasped. She looked back once toward the orphanage windows, where young faces watched with a mixture of terror and awe, toward Sister Margaret's distant figure still maintaining her vigil in the courtyard, toward Father Brennan's head visible in her small attic window. Then she jumped into the unknown, carrying secrets that powerful men wanted to bury, trusting in visions that defied institutional explanation, choosing chaos over the kind of safety that required her to abandon the most important thing she had ever discovered about herself. The ground rushed up to meet her with brutal finality. The impact drove every molecule of air from her lungs in a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Mariel's left ankle twisted beneath her with an audible crack that seemed to echo off the orphanage walls, and the remaining drawings exploded from her arms like confessions scattered to an unforgiving wind. She lay crumpled on the frozen earth, watching helplessly as her most precious possessions danced away on winter gusts. The Virgin Mary's face spun past her field of vision, those impossibly detailed eyes that had taken her 3 sleepless nights to capture now tumbling toward the pine forest, where they would be lost forever. Pages covered with ancient script, symbols that had flowed from her pencil with divine certainty, wrapped themselves around fence posts and disappeared into snowdrifts like secrets the universe had decided she was unworthy to keep. "Secure those papers, every single one." Monsignor Harrison's voice cut through the Montana air with military precision. Dark figures converged from multiple directions, their hands already reaching for the scattered evidence of her visions. These weren't the gentle caretakers who had raised her. These were professionals, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who specialized in containing problems that threatened institutional stability. Through the haze of pain radiating from her ankle, Mariel watched a man in a heavy coat carefully collect the drawing that had landed near the chapel steps. Her most recent vision, the one where the Virgin Mary's lips had seemed to move, whispering words in Aramaic that Mariel couldn't understand but somehow felt compelled to transcribe in flowing script around the figure's luminous robes. Now it was just evidence to be catalogued and buried, proof of psychological breakdown rather than divine communication. "Easy now, child. Don't try to move." Sister Margaret knelt beside her, the nun's weathered hands gentle but her face grave with something that looked like mourning. "You've hurt yourself badly." The physical pain was nothing compared to the anguish of watching 11 years of secret spiritual communion being systematically erased. Each rescued drawing disappeared into briefcases and manila folders, transformed from sacred art into clinical specimens. The men worked with practiced thoroughness, checking gutters and searching beneath vehicles, ensuring that no trace of her visions would remain to complicate their narrative of teenage mental illness. Father Brennan approached more slowly, his face a complicated map of concern and something that might have been guilt. When he knelt on her other side, she could smell incense and old books on his clothing, scents that had once comforted her during evening prayers, but now seemed to mock her fallen state. "Why?" he asked softly, and she heard genuine bewilderment in his voice. "Why risk everything for drawings? We could have worked together, found a way to preserve what matters while getting you the help you need." "Help?" The word tasted like betrayal in the frigid air. They still couldn't see that their help was the very thing that would destroy what mattered most. In sterile rooms under fluorescent lights, surrounded by people trained to medicate away inconvenient spiritual experiences, would the visions continue to come? Would her hand still move with divine purpose when psychiatric protocols had explained away every mystery as neurochemical imbalance? "Transport is en route," one of Harrison's men reported. speaking into a radio with the casual tone of someone arranging cargo pickup. ETA 15 minutes. 15 minutes until they loaded her into a vehicle that would carry her away from the only home she had ever known, toward facilities equipped to cure her of experiences that felt more real than anything else in her 17-year existence. The younger girls watched from orphanage windows like witnesses to an execution, their faces pressed against glass fogged with breath and tears. Mariel tried to sit up, but her ankle sent lightning bolts of agony up her leg, and Sister Margaret's firm hand on her shoulder kept her horizontal against the frozen ground. The defeat was complete. She couldn't run, couldn't hide, couldn't even preserve the artistic evidence of her spiritual calling. Everything she had fought to protect was already disappearing into institutional machinery designed to process away inconvenient miracles. "The last page," she whispered, the words scraping her throat like rusty nails. "Under the woodshed. Please." Father Brennan's eyes followed her gaze to where a single corner of white paper protruded from beneath the structure. He hesitated for a long moment, glancing toward Harrison, then moved carefully to retrieve what might be her final vision. When he unfolded it, his breath caught audibly. Mariel couldn't see the drawing from her position, but she remembered creating it. The Virgin Mary's hands cupped as if holding water, and within that sacred vessel faces, dozens of children's faces, some familiar from local newspaper stories about missing persons, others completely unknown but rendered with photographic detail that her conscious mind couldn't explain. Father Brennan's face had gone white. He stared at the paper with the expression of someone witnessing either profound blasphemy or undeniable miracle, and Mariel knew that everything, her fate, her future, perhaps even her sanity, now hung on which interpretation he chose to embrace. Father Brennan's hands trembled as he held the drawing, his eyes moving frantically between the paper and Mariel's face. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap, broken only by the distant sound of an approaching engine, the transport that would carry her away from everything she had ever known. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, then immediately crossed himself for the blasphemy. But his gaze remained fixed on the paper, studying each rendered face with growing horror. This child here, his finger hovered over one of the smaller faces nestled in the Virgin's cupped palms. "This is Timothy Morrison. He's been missing from Kalispell for 3 months. Monsignor Harrison moved closer, irritation flickering across his features. "Father, we don't have time for—" "And this one." Brennan's voice cracked. "Sarah Chen from Missoula. The FBI has been searching since November." He looked up at Harrison with something approaching accusation. How could she know their faces? "These cases haven't been in local papers. The details were restricted to law enforcement." Mariel watched understanding dawn across the priest's face, like sunrise over the Montana peaks, terrible and illuminating and impossible to ignore. The pain in her ankle seemed distant now, overwhelmed by the electric realization that someone finally saw what she had been trying to communicate through her art. "Coincidence," Harrison said firmly, but his voice lacked conviction. "The girl has access to newspapers, television—" "No." Father Brennan stood slowly, the drawing clutched against his chest like a shield. "Look at the precision. These aren't approximations or artistic interpretations. These are photographic likenesses." His eyes found Mariel's, and she saw something she had never dared hope for: belief. "How many others? How many more faces have you drawn?" The words came slowly, each one feeling like glass in her throat. "Dozens, years of them. Always the same, children in water, in the Virgin's hands." She struggled to sit up despite Sister Margaret's restraining touch. "They show me where. The places. I've drawn the places." Harrison stepped forward, his face flushed with authority under threat. "This is precisely the kind of delusional thinking that confirms our diagnosis. She's constructed an elaborate fantasy." "Then explain this." Father Brennan thrust the drawing toward the Monsignor. "Explain how a girl who hasn't left these grounds in 11 years knows the exact facial features of children who've gone missing across 3 states. Explain the geographical precision of locations that aren't public knowledge." A terrible understanding began to crystallize in the frigid air between them. Mariel watched Father Brennan's face cycle through disbelief, recognition, and something approaching horror as the implications settled into place. The Virgin Mary hadn't been showing her future visions. She had been revealing suppressed memories, fragments of truth that had been buried beneath 11 years of protective silence. "The car accident," Father Brennan said slowly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Tell me about the car accident, Mariel." The question hit her like a physical blow, awakening memories that had been carefully sealed away. Suddenly, she was 6 years old again, pressed against the back seat window as their car wound through unfamiliar mountain roads. Her parents' voices, tight with fear and urgency, her mother turning back to whisper reassurances that everything would be all right. They were almost safe, just a little farther. "We weren't going to church," she whispered, the words coming from some deep well of buried truth. "We were running. They were taking me somewhere safe." The memory unfurled like a poisonous flower, revealing details that her child's mind had been too young to understand, but too damaged to forget. The other car, it wasn't an accident. They were waiting. Father Brennan's face had gone ashen. Who was waiting? But before she could answer, Harrison moved with surprising speed, snatching the drawing from Brennan's hands and tearing it in half. "Enough. This girl is clearly experiencing a complete psychological break. Every word she speaks confirms the need for immediate intervention." "You're destroying evidence," Father Brennan said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm protecting the church from scandal," Harrison shot back. "From the delusional ravings of a disturbed child who's constructed an elaborate fantasy around childhood trauma." He gestured toward the approaching headlights. "The transport will take her to professionals who can provide appropriate treatment for these dissociative episodes." But Mariel was no longer listening to their argument. The torn drawing in Harrison's hands had triggered something deeper than memory, a recognition that made her stomach turn with sick certainty. She knew that efficient way he destroyed evidence. She had seen it before, in fragmented memories that her conscious mind had refused to process. "You," she breathed, staring at Harrison with dawning horror. "You were there. The night they killed my parents, you were there." The Monsignor's face went completely still, and in that moment of perfect silence, everything shifted. The transport vehicle pulled into the courtyard, its headlights casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward them like grasping fingers, and Mariel finally understood that she hadn't been running toward safety. She had been living within the very darkness her parents had died trying to escape. The transport vehicle's engine idled in the courtyard like a mechanical predator, its headlights cutting through the Montana darkness with surgical precision. Mariel felt the truth settling into her bones with the weight of 11 years of buried memory, but she also felt something else, a crystalline clarity that transformed her terror into something harder, more dangerous. "Sister Margaret," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the pain radiating from her ankle. "The night I arrived here, what did they tell you about my injuries?" The nun's weathered face creased with confusion. "Child, this isn't the time." "What injuries?" Mariel pressed, watching Harrison's face from her peripheral vision. "Besides the broken ribs and the head trauma, what else was wrong with me?" Sister Margaret's hands stilled on Mariel's shoulders. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 11 years of carefully buried suspicion. "The doctors said there were signs of prolonged captivity, malnutrition, evidence that you'd been restrained." Her eyes moved between Mariel and Harrison with growing alarm. "They said it was consistent with the trauma of being trapped in the wreckage for hours, but it wasn't hours," Mariel finished. "It was weeks, maybe months. The memories were flooding back now, unstoppable as mountain snowmelt. I wasn't in a car accident, sister. I was rescued from one." Father Brennan stepped closer, his body positioning itself protectively between Mariel and the approaching transport team. "Mariel, listen to me very carefully. If what you're saying is true, if you witnessed something that night—" "She witnessed nothing," Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp with authority. "She's a traumatized child fabricating elaborate delusions. The transport is here, and this conversation ends now." But something had shifted in the power dynamic. Sister Margaret's protective grip on Mariel's shoulders had transformed from restraint to shield. Father Brennan's earlier uncertainty had crystallized into grim determination. Even some of the younger nuns who had emerged to witness the commotion were looking at Harrison with new wariness. "The other children," Mariel continued, her voice gaining strength, "in my drawings. They weren't visions of strangers. They were memories of the ones who didn't survive what I survived." She struggled to sit up, her ankles screaming protest, but her resolve burning brighter than the pain. "The Virgin Mary wasn't showing me prophecies. She was helping me remember what you made me forget." Harrison gestured sharply to the transport team. "Sedate her. Now." She's becoming increasingly agitated. But Father Brennan moved faster, stepping directly into their path. "By whose authority?" His voice carried the full weight of his clerical rank. "I am the appointed investigator for this matter, and I'm ordering you to stand down until we can verify these allegations." "Father Brennan," Harrison's tone dripped condescension, "you're allowing yourself to be manipulated by a deeply disturbed individual. Step aside." Instead, Father Brennan knelt beside Mariel again, his voice urgent but gentle. "The places in your drawings, the locations where you saw the children, can you describe them specifically enough for law enforcement to investigate?" The question unlocked something in her mind, like tumblers falling into place. The abandoned mine shaft 30 miles north of Glacier National Park, the old logging camp near Hungry Horse Reservoir, the basement of the rectory in St. Ignatius. Each location emerged with photographic clarity, accompanied by details that made her stomach churn. "I can draw maps, exact coordinates. I remember everything now." Sister Margaret's sharp intake of breath cut through the night air. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God." The reports from St. Ignatius, Father McKenna's sudden reassignment 3 years ago. "Enough!" Harrison's composure finally cracked, revealing something vicious underneath. "This ends now. Transport team, proceed with the pickup." But the transport team hesitated, their professional certainty shaken by the theological authority dispute playing out before them. In that moment of hesitation, Mariel saw her opportunity. "Sister Margaret," she said urgently, "the key to Father Brennan's office. I need paper and pencils. Give me 1 hour, and I'll provide enough evidence to bring down whatever they've been covering up." The nun looked between Harrison's furious face and Father Brennan's encouraging nod. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades protecting children. "Monsignor Harrison, I'm invoking sanctuary protocols. This child is under the protection of St. Catherine's until a full investigation can be completed. You have no authority to—" "I have every authority," Sister Margaret replied firmly, rising to her full height. "This is still a house of God, and I am still its designated guardian. Transport team, you may leave. Your services are no longer required." As the confused security personnel looked between competing authorities, Mariel felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced in years. The memories were terrible, but they were also weapons. And for the first time in 11 silent years, she had allies willing to help her wield them. The real battle was just beginning. The transport team's departure left an electric tension hanging in the courtyard air. Harrison stood rigid beside his official vehicle, speaking in urgent whispers into his radio while casting venomous glances toward the orphanage entrance where Sister Margaret had shepherded them all inside. Mariel sat in Father Brennan's office, her injured ankle elevated on a stack of theological texts, but her hands moving with fevered purpose across sheet after sheet of paper. Each drawing emerged with the clarity of a photograph developing in solution, buildings, faces, geographical landmarks that her conscious mind shouldn't remember, but her artist's hand rendered with devastating precision. "This one," she said, pushing a completed sketch toward Father Brennan. "The warehouse district in Billings, 3rd building from the railroad tracks. There's a blue door with a broken handle and stairs that go down to a basement with no windows." Father Brennan studied the drawing with growing horror. The architectural details were impossibly specific, the exact placement of overhead pipes, the pattern of water stains on concrete walls. Even the arrangement of chains hanging from ceiling hooks, no child could fabricate such precision. How many children were held there? His voice was barely a whisper. Mariel's pencil moved across another sheet, sketching faces with mechanical efficiency. I don't know. The drugs made everything fuzzy. But I remember voices crying in the darkness. And I remember him. She glanced toward the window, where Harrison's shadow paced back and forth, talking to other men in expensive suits, planning shipments. Sister Margaret entered carrying a tray of hot tea, but her hands trembled as she set it down. Child? Are you saying there was trafficking? Human trafficking involving church officials? Not just involving, Mariel replied, her pencil never pausing. Coordinating. The network used churches as safe houses, orphanages as supply sources, children without families, without advocates. Who would report us missing? The implications hit the room like a physical blow. Father Brennan sank into his chair, his face ashen as he processed the scope of what Mariel was revealing. Decades of missing children, systematic abuse hidden behind ecclesiastical authority, a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of diocesan administration. Your parents, he said slowly. They discovered this? Mariel's hands stilled for the first time since she'd begun drawing. When she looked up, her eyes held the accumulated pain of 11 years of buried truth. My father was a social worker. My mother taught at the Catholic school in Missoula. They started noticing patterns, children who disappeared from their programs, adoption records that didn't match placement reports. Her voice grew stronger, more determined. They were going to expose everything, so the network eliminated them and reclaimed their evidence. You, Sister Margaret breathed, understanding dawning across her weathered features. I was the evidence, Mariel confirmed. A 6-year-old witness who had seen too much, known too many faces. But instead of killing me, Harrison convinced them I could be more useful alive. A traumatized mute who could never testify, hidden away in a remote orphanage where he could monitor me for signs that my memory was returning. Through the office window, they could see Harrison still pacing beside his vehicle, his radio conversations growing more animated. Father Brennan followed her gaze, and his expression hardened with resolve. He's calling for backup, the priest said grimly. More transport teams, probably armed with psychiatric commitment orders that will override our sanctuary claim. Mariel pushed the completed drawings toward him, a stack of evidence that could dismantle an entire criminal network if it reached the right authorities. Then we need to move fast. These locations, these faces, some of those children might still be alive, still captive. Sister Margaret moved to the window, her voice tight with urgency. 2 more vehicles just turned into our drive, official plates. Father Brennan began gathering the drawings, but Mariel grabbed his wrist. Not all of them, she said intensely. Harrison will find a way to confiscate everything if we keep them together. We need insurance, backup copies, multiple delivery methods. Understanding sparked in the priest's eyes. Sister Margaret, the convent in Helena. Sister Catherine has connections with the FBI field office. I can have copies there within 3 hours, the nun confirmed, already moving toward the office's ancient photocopier. As the machine hummed to life, Mariel felt something she hadn't experienced since that terrible night 11 years ago, the possibility of justice. Her parents' sacrifice might finally serve its intended purpose. The children whose faces haunted her drawings might find peace. But she also understood the magnitude of what she was committing to. Harrison's network had killed to protect their secrets before. They wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a 17-year-old girl who threatened their entire operation. Once we send these, she said quietly, watching the last of the evening light fade beyond the window, there's no turning back. They'll come for us with everything they have. Father Brennan met her gaze steadily. Then we better make sure the truth reaches daylight before they can bury it again. Outside, car doors slammed like gunshots in the gathering darkness, and Mariel knew their time was almost up. Heavy boots echoed across the orphanage's wooden floors as Harrison's reinforcements spread through the building. Mariel could hear them moving with military precision, checking exits, securing perimeters, cutting off escape routes. The ancient photocopier continued its labored humming, each page emerging with agonizing slowness while precious seconds ticked away. "How many more?" Father Brennan asked urgently, his hands already gathering the completed copies. "6 more pages," Sister Margaret replied, feeding another drawing into the machine. "But they're searching room by room. We have maybe 5 minutes before they reach this corridor." Mariel's mind raced through everything she had learned during her years of careful observation, every detail she had absorbed about St. Catherine's layout and the adults who controlled it. The building held secrets beyond even her own story, hidden passages used during Prohibition, forgotten maintenance tunnels that connected to the old coal cellar. Her silence had made her invisible, allowed her to witness conversations and discover routes that others assumed she couldn't understand or remember. "Sister Margaret," she said quietly, "the coal chute behind the kitchen pantry. Does it still connect to the old delivery tunnel?" The nun's eyes widened with understanding. "Child, that passage hasn't been used in decades. The tunnel floods during spring thaw." "But not in winter," Mariel interrupted. "And it emerges near the highway, past the main gate. If someone could reach Helena by morning—" Father Brennan was already dividing the copied drawings into 3 separate bundles. "One set stays here as evidence of our good faith, one set goes to the FBI through Sister Catherine, and the third I take to the state authorities in Missoula," Sister Margaret finished. "Direct testimony from the witness herself." "No," Mariel's voice carried absolute conviction. "You both stay here and provide cover. Make them think I'm still in the building while I use the tunnel." She struggled to her feet, testing weight on her injured ankle. The pain was excruciating but manageable. "I know those drawings better than anyone. I can answer questions about details that might not translate clearly on paper." Footsteps echoed closer now, accompanied by the crackle of radio communications. Harrison's voice cut through the background noise, sharp with authority. "Check the offices. She's hiding somewhere on the 2nd floor." Father Brennan moved to the door, sliding the bolt lock into place, a barrier that would buy them maybe 3 minutes before Harrison's team broke through. "Mariel, listen to me carefully. Once you enter that tunnel, you'll be completely on your own. No backup, no protection. If they catch me, I'll finally break my silence in a way that matters," she replied, tucking the most crucial drawings inside her jacket. 11 years I've been their insurance policy, the perfect victim who couldn't speak against them. That ends tonight." Sister Margaret pressed a small flashlight into her hands, along with $20 from the orphanage's emergency fund. "The tunnel exits near Miller's Creek. Follow the creek bed south for half a mile until you reach Highway 93. Flag down the first law enforcement vehicle you see. What if there aren't any? What if Harrison's people are monitoring the roads?" The nun's weathered face hardened with determination that had sustained her through 40 years of protecting children. "Then you keep walking until you find someone willing to listen. But you don't stop, and you don't come back here until this is finished." Heavy footsteps stopped directly outside the office door, followed by the metallic rattle of someone testing the handle. Harrison's voice carried clearly through the wood, "Open this door immediately, or we'll break it down." Mariel moved toward the office's rear window, her injured ankle screaming protest with each step. The coal chute was directly below, a rusted metal slide that had once delivered heating fuel to the orphanage's basement. From there she could crawl through the delivery tunnel and emerge beyond the perimeter that Harrison's team had established. 60 seconds, she whispered, positioning herself at the window. "Then break the door down and act surprised that I'm gone. Make them tear apart every room in this building." Father Brennan gripped her shoulder, his eyes reflecting the weight of what they were asking her to endure. "Your parents would be proud of the woman you've become." The words hit her harder than she expected, unlocking a reservoir of strength she hadn't known existed. For 11 years she had survived by remaining invisible, by keeping her truth buried beneath protective silence. But survival wasn't enough anymore. The children in her drawings deserved justice. The families destroyed by Harrison's network deserved answers. Something heavy struck the office door, splintering wood around the lock mechanism. Mariel swung her leg over the windowsill, gritting her teeth against the pane as she prepared to drop toward the coal chute. Behind her, Sister Margaret and Father Brennan took positions that would make her escape look impossible, their faces set with the quiet courage of those who had finally chosen sides in a war they could no longer ignore. The door exploded inward just as Mariel disappeared into the darkness below. The coal chute's rusted metal edges tore at Mariel's clothing as she slid into the orphanage's bowels, landing hard in a pile of decades-old coal dust that filled her lungs with gritty darkness. Above her, she could hear Harrison's voice exploding with rage as he discovered the empty office, his commands echoing through the building like gunshots. "Find her, check every room, every closet, every inch of this place." Mariel crawled forward through the delivery tunnel, her injured ankle dragging behind her as she followed the weak beam of Sister Margaret's flashlight. The concrete walls pressed close on either side, slick with moisture and decades of neglect. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony up her leg, but she bit down on her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as she forced herself deeper into the narrow passage. Behind her, the orphanage erupted into chaos. Doors slammed, heavy boots thundered across floors. She could hear furniture being overturned, walls being struck with rifle butts as Harrison's team searched for hidden panels or concealed spaces. The sound grew fainter as she crawled, but never disappeared entirely, a constant reminder of what waited if she failed. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, each foot gained through sheer determination. Her jacket caught on protruding rebar, tearing as she pulled free, but the drawings remained safely pressed against her chest. Those pages represented more than evidence. They were the voices of children who had never been heard, the testimony of victims who had been silenced by violence or terror. When she finally emerged near Miller's Creek, the December air hit her like a physical blow. Snow had begun falling again, thick flakes that would cover her tracks but also make the journey more treacherous. She paused behind a stand of pine trees, listening for any sign of pursuit, then limped toward the creek bed that would guide her to the highway. The water ran black between ice-crusted banks, and Mariel followed its winding path through the darkness, using tree branches for support when her ankle threatened to collapse entirely. Each step took enormous effort, but with each yard gained, she felt herself growing stronger rather than weaker. The weight of 11 years of silence was finally lifting from her shoulders. She had traveled perhaps a quarter-mile when headlights swept across the trees ahead. Mariel dropped instinctively behind a fallen log, her heart hammering as she watched a black SUV crawl slowly along the highway. Harrison's people, already expanding their search perimeter, they knew about the tunnel. The vehicle passed without stopping, but Mariel understood that her window for reaching help was closing rapidly. Harrison's network had resources, connections, the ability to monitor communications and intercept law enforcement calls. If she was going to expose them, it had to be decisive and immediate. When the SUV's taillights disappeared around a bend, she struggled back to her feet and pushed forward with renewed urgency. The creek bed provided cover, but it also slowed her progress significantly. Every few minutes she heard vehicles on the highway above, some moving at normal speeds, others crawling like hunting predators. It was nearly midnight when she finally spotted the gas station's neon sign bleeding red light across the snow. A Montana State Patrol cruiser sat beside the building, its occupant visible through the window talking with the night clerk. Mariel felt a surge of desperate hope, but also terrifying doubt. What if Harrison's corruption reached into state law enforcement? What if she was walking directly into another trap? She crouched at the edge of the parking lot, studying the trooper's body language, searching for any sign that this might be a setup. The officer appeared young, maybe early 30s, with the earnest demeanor of someone who hadn't yet learned to compromise his principles for political expedience. But appearances could deceive. Harrison himself projected trustworthy authority when it served his purposes. A car engine growled to life somewhere behind her, growing steadily louder. Mariel turned to see headlights sweeping through the trees along the creek bed, following the exact path she had taken. No more time for doubt or careful observation. She limped across the parking lot as fast as her injured ankle would allow, drawing the drawings from her jacket as she moved. When she pushed through the gas station's door, the trooper looked up with mild curiosity that quickly shifted to concern as he registered her appearance. Torn clothing, coal dust in her hair, blood on her lip, and the desperate intensity burning in her eyes. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the small space. "My name is Mariel Santos, and I have evidence of a human trafficking network operating through the Catholic diocese. Children are dying, and the man responsible is about 3 minutes behind me." The trooper's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, but Mariel stepped closer, spreading the drawings across the counter with swift precision. "Look at these," she commanded, her 11 years of silence transforming into unstoppable momentum. "Look at them and tell me if you're willing to let this continue for even one more night." Outside, headlights turned into the parking lot. The trooper, his nameplate read Davidson, stared at the drawings spread across the counter, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and grim recognition. Mariel watched his eyes move from face to face, location to location, understanding dawning like a terrible sunrise. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, then caught himself. "Sorry, miss, but these children, I recognize some of them. Missing persons cases from 3 counties over the past 5 years. The gas station door chimed as Harrison entered, his expensive suit somehow still immaculate, despite the night's chaos. He moved with predatory confidence, his smile warm and paternal as he approached. "Thank God you found her, officer," Harrison said smoothly. "We've been searching everywhere. Poor Mariel suffers from severe psychological trauma. She's been missing from St. Catherine's for hours. We were terrified she might hurt herself." Davidson's hand rested on his service weapon, his eyes still fixed on the drawings. "And you are?" "Michael Harrison, diocesan administrator. This young lady is under church guardianship." Harrison's voice carried practiced authority, the tone of someone accustomed to being believed without question. "She has episodes where she creates these fantasies, elaborate stories about things that never happened." Mariel felt the familiar weight of powerlessness pressing down on her, the same crushing sensation she'd experienced as a 6-year-old watching her parents die. Harrison was doing exactly what he'd done for 11 years, using his position, his credibility, his institutional backing to make her truth invisible. But she wasn't 6 anymore, and she was no longer silent. "Officer Davidson," she said clearly, "ask him about the scar on his left wrist. Ask him how he got it." Her finger moved to one of the drawings, a detailed portrait of Harrison strangling a teenage boy. "Ask him about Tommy Blackhorse, age 14, who fought back hard enough to leave marks." Harrison's composure flickered for just an instant, his left hand instinctively moving to cover his wrist. That tiny gesture spoke louder than any denial he could offer. Davidson stepped back, creating space between himself and both of them, his radio already in his hand. "I'm going to need backup out here, and I want everyone to stay exactly where they are until we sort this out." "Officer, please," Harrison tried again, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "This girl has been institutionalized before. She's dangerous, unstable. Then you won't mind waiting while I verify these drawings with our missing persons database." Davidson cut him off. He was young, but not stupid. The evidence spread across the counter was too detailed, too accurate to dismiss as fantasy. Mariel felt something breaking open inside her chest, not the familiar crack of trauma, but the release of truth finally given space to breathe. For 11 years, she had carried these secrets alone, trapped in silence while Harrison manipulated her story to serve his purposes. But now, standing in the harsh fluorescent light of this roadside gas station, she finally understood what her parents had died trying to do. "There's more," she said quietly, pulling the final drawing from her jacket, the one she had hidden even from Father Brennan. "This is Harrison's superior, Bishop Caldwell, and this is the facility in Canada where they take the children who don't survive the initial transport." Harrison lunged forward. desperation finally cracking his careful facade. "You don't understand what you're destroying. The network provides services, protection for children who would otherwise—" Davidson's weapon cleared its holster in one smooth motion. "Step back. Now." But Mariel was no longer focused on Harrison. She was looking at the last drawing in her hands, the one that had cost her everything to remember, everything to create. Her parents' faces stared back at her from the paper, not as they had died, but as they had lived. Proud, determined, willing to sacrifice everything to protect children they had never even met. "Officer," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, "I need you to understand something. When you arrest this man, when you shut down this network, there will be retaliation. Other children in other places will be moved, hidden, possibly killed to prevent them from testifying. The church will claim this is an attack on religious freedom. Politicians will call it a witch hunt." She folded the drawing carefully, holding it against her heart. "But those children, the ones who are still alive, still trapped, they deserve the chance my parents never got to give them. They deserve someone willing to speak the truth, even when it costs everything." Outside, sirens wailed through the winter night, growing closer. Harrison's face had gone grey with the recognition of defeat, but his eyes still burned with calculation, already planning appeals and cover-ups and damage control. Mariel looked at him one final time, then turned away. She had given up her silence, her safety, her home, everything she had clung to for 11 years. But in return, she had reclaimed something infinitely more precious, the ability to honor her parents' sacrifice by finishing what they had started. The truth was finally free. The squad cars arrived in a cascade of red and blue light, their sirens cutting through the winter silence like judgment itself. Mariel watched through the gas station window as Officer Davidson's backup surrounded Harrison, their movements precise and professional, despite the shocking nature of what they were processing. Harrison submitted to the handcuffs with eerie calm, as if he had always known this moment would eventually come. "Miss Santos?" Davidson approached her carefully, his voice gentler now that the immediate danger had passed. "The ambulance is here. We need to get that ankle looked at, and there are federal agents en route who'll want to debrief you properly." Mariel nodded, but she couldn't seem to move from where she stood. For 11 years, she had imagined this moment, the collapse of Harrison's network, the exposure of the truth her parents had died protecting. But now that it was actually happening, she felt strangely hollow, as if the weight of her secrets had been holding her together all along. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. "Really over?" Davidson exchanged glances with another trooper before answering. "The immediate threat is contained. But you were right about what comes next. We're already getting calls from church lawyers, and the FBI says there are political implications that reach pretty high up the food chain." Through the window, Mariel could see Harrison being loaded into the back of a patrol car. Even in handcuffs, he maintained his dignified bearing, his expression suggesting this was merely a temporary setback rather than total defeat. The sight sent ice through her veins. She knew that look, had seen it countless times when he thought she wasn't watching. He was already planning his next move. The ambulance doors opened, and paramedics approached with a stretcher. As they began examining her ankle, Mariel found herself thinking about St. Catherine's, about the children who were probably lying awake right now wondering where she had gone. Sister Margaret and Father Brennan would be fielding questions from federal investigators, their own futures uncertain now that they had chosen to stand with her against the institution they had served their entire lives. "The other children at the orphanage," she said suddenly. "They need to be protected. Harrison won't be the only one who knows where to find them." Already being handled, the paramedic assured her as he wrapped her ankle. "FBI has teams en route to secure the facility and interview potential witnesses. No one gets near those kids without federal oversight." But even as relief washed over her, Mariel understood that the hardest part was just beginning. Harrison's arrest was only the first domino to fall. There would be trials, testimony, media attention that would strip away every layer of privacy she had left. The silence that had protected her for 11 years was gone forever, replaced by a spotlight that would follow her for the rest of her life. As they loaded her into the ambulance, she caught sight of Father Brennan's car pulling into the parking lot. He climbed out slowly, his face etched with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. When their eyes met through the ambulance window, he offered a small smile that carried more weight than any words could have. The paramedic noticed her watching. "Friend of yours?" "He believed me," Mariel said simply, when no one else would. The ambulance doors closed, and they pulled onto the highway heading toward Helena. Through the back window, Mariel watched the gas station's neon sign fade into the distance, taking with it the last remnants of the girl who had lived in silence for so long. She didn't know who she would become now that her voice was free, but for the first time since her parents' death, she felt ready to find out. A jacket pocket held one final drawing, the portrait of her parents she had shown Harrison. She pulled it out now, studying their faces in the ambulance's dim interior lighting. They looked proud, determined, unafraid of the cost their principles might demand. "I kept my promise," she whispered to their memory. "I finished what you started." The ambulance rounded a curve, and Helena's lights appeared in the valley below, a sprawling constellation that seemed to pulse with possibility rather than threat. Somewhere in that city, federal agents were preparing to dismantle a network that had operated in shadows for decades. Families would finally learn what had happened to their missing children. Justice would begin its slow, imperfect work. Mariel folded the drawing carefully and tucked it away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, depositions and courtrooms, and the inevitable attempts to discredit her testimony. But tonight, for the first time in 11 years, she would sleep knowing that her silence could never again be used as a weapon against the innocent. The truth was finally free, and so was she. The hospital room felt too bright after 11 years of shadows. Mariel sat propped against starched pillows, her ankle elevated and wrapped, watching the morning news coverage through the window's reflection on her water glass. The headlines scrolled past in fragments: church officials arrested, missing children found, trafficking network exposed, but the words felt distant, like reports from someone else's life. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sister Margaret stood in the doorway, her usually perfect habit slightly disheveled, dark circles under her eyes. She carried a small canvas bag and moved with the hesitant steps of someone entering sacred ground. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," Sister Margaret said quietly. Mariel studied the woman who had raised her for 11 years, searching for signs of the person she thought she'd known. "Are you here because you're sorry, or because the FBI told you to come?" "Because I've spent 3 sleepless nights trying to figure out how I could have been so blind." Sister Margaret set the bag on the bedside table and remained standing, her hands clasped tightly. "And because you're still my daughter, no matter how badly I failed you." The word daughter hit Mariel like a physical blow. She had dreamed of hearing it spoken with such fierce tenderness, but now it came wrapped in layers of guilt and regret that made it almost impossible to accept. "I brought your things," Sister Margaret continued, gesturing to the bag. "Your art supplies, some clothes, though I suppose you won't be coming back to St. Catherine's." "Would you want me to?" Mariel asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "After everything?" Sister Margaret finally sat down, her composure cracking like ice in spring. "I want you to have the childhood I stole from you. I want to go back and listen when you tried to tell me about the nightmares. I want to be the mother you needed instead of the warden I became." Tears fell freely now, and Mariel felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of understanding. Sister Margaret had been as trapped as anyone, caught between institutional loyalty and maternal instinct, choosing what she believed was protection over what Mariel needed most: to be heard. "I remember when you first arrived," Sister Margaret whispered. 6 years old, clutching that torn photograph of your parents. You tried to tell me about the bad man who hurt them, but the doctors said trauma could create false memories. I thought I was protecting you by encouraging you to forget." Mariel reached into the canvas bag and pulled out her sketch pad. its pages filled with 11 years of silent testimony. She flipped to a drawing from her early days at St. Catherine's, Sister Margaret reading bedtime stories, her face gentle in lamplight. "You did protect me," Mariel said, her voice softer now. "Not from Harrison, I know that, but from despair, from giving up completely. You gave me a reason to keep going even when I couldn't remember why." Sister Margaret's shoulders shook with quiet sobs. "The children are asking about you. Little Tommy wants to know when you're coming home to finish teaching him to draw. Maria keeps checking your bed at night to make sure you haven't disappeared like the others." The mention of the younger children sent a pang through Mariel's heart. They were her family in ways that bloodlines could never define, fellow survivors who had found safety in each other's presence. But home was a complicated word now, weighted with meanings she was still learning to navigate. "I'll visit," she promised, "when the investigation settles and it's safe. But I can't go back to being the girl who lived in silence. That person, she was necessary for a while, but she can't exist anymore." Another knock interrupted them. Father Brennan appeared in the doorway, his clerical collar absent, wearing simple civilian clothes that made him look younger and somehow more vulnerable. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I wanted to check on you before I leave for Rome." "Rome?" Mariel's eyebrows rose. "Are you in trouble?" Father Brennan's smile was rueful. "Let's say the Vatican wants a very detailed explanation of recent events. But I'm not sorry for what we did. Truth has a way of demanding courage from all of us, eventually." He approached the bed and held out a small wooden cross, its surface smooth from years of handling. "This was your mother's. The police found it in Harrison's effects and thought you should have it." Mariel took the cross with trembling fingers, feeling the worn spots where her mother's thumbs had rubbed during prayer. It was like holding a piece of her parents' love made tangible, proof that their sacrifice had meaning beyond the horror of their death. "What happens now?" she asked, looking between the two people who had shaped her life in such different ways. "Now you become who you were always meant to be," Sister Margaret said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "And we learn to love you as that person, not as the child we thought we were protecting." Outside, Helena stretched beneath winter sunshine, no longer a place of threat, but of possibility. Mariel was finally free to discover who she might become when her voice belonged completely to herself. 6 months later, Mariel stood at the easel in her new apartment's sunlit living room, brush poised over canvas as morning light streamed through windows she could open whenever she chose. The painting taking shape before her was different from anything she had created before, not a memory dragged from trauma's depths, but a vision of possibility. Children played in a garden where sunflowers grew tall enough to hide secrets that were joyful rather than terrible. The apartment was small but hers, funded by a victim's compensation settlement that felt both inadequate and overwhelming. 2 bedrooms, kitchen with a window over the sink, walls she could paint any color she wanted. After 11 years of institutional beige, she had chosen warm yellows and soft greens, colors that whispered of growth rather than confinement. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Chen, the trauma therapist who had become both professional support and unexpected friend. "Remember, testimony prep at 2 p.m. You've got this." The trial was next week. Harrison and 3 other diocesan officials would finally face justice, their carefully constructed denials crumbling under the weight of evidence Mariel's art had helped uncover. 14 missing children found. 12 families given answers they had prayed for across years of agonizing uncertainty. 2 predators who thought they were untouchable, learning that institutional protection had limits. But today, before courtrooms and cross-examinations, she had a different kind of appointment. The knock came precisely at 11, as expected. Mariel opened the door to find a nervous-looking teenager with paint-stained fingers and eyes that held too much wariness for someone barely 15. "You're Mariel?" the girl asked. "I'm Casey, from the group home." "Come in," Mariel said gently, recognizing the hypervigilance in Casey's posture, the way her gaze catalogued every exit and potential threat. "Would you like some tea? Coffee? Just water, thanks." Casey perched on the edge of the couch like a bird ready for flight, clutching a battered sketchbook. Dr. Chen had connected them, another young artist whose trauma spoke in images rather than words, who needed to see that survival was possible, that voices stolen could be reclaimed. Dr. Chen said you might understand, Casey said quietly, about the dreams, about seeing things you're not supposed to remember. Mariel set down 2 glasses of water and settled into the opposite chair, maintaining careful distance. What do you see? Faces, places, things that happened to me and other kids before I got to the group home. Casey's voice dropped to barely a whisper. But everyone says it's impossible. I was too young. Trauma does weird things to memory. Show me, Mariel said simply. Casey opened her sketchbook with trembling hands. The drawings spilled across the pages like visual testimony, detailed portraits, architectural sketches, fragments of license plates and telephone numbers that felt both random and significant. Mariel recognized the precision born of desperate need to preserve truth when no one else would listen. These are remarkable, she said, and meant it. Have you shown them to anyone? The counselors think art therapy is good for processing, but they don't want to look too closely at what I'm actually drawing. Casey's laugh held bitter edges. They prefer when I paint flowers and rainbows. Mariel understood that dynamic intimately. Adults who encouraged expression while simultaneously limiting what could safely be expressed. She moved to her own easel, pulling out a painting from the early days after her testimony broke everything open. Dark swirls of memory and fear, but shot through with golden threads of truth finely given voice. This is what it looked like when I first started remembering everything, she said. Ugly, painful, but necessary. Casey studied the painting with the intensity of someone seeing their own experience reflected for the first time. Does it get easier? Different, Mariel said honestly. The nightmares fade, but the responsibility doesn't. Once you remember, once you speak, you become someone who knows things other people would rather deny. That's not always comfortable. But you sleep at night now? Most nights. Mariel smiled, thinking of how miraculous that simple truth felt. And I dream about tomorrow instead of only yesterday. They painted together for 2 hours, Casey gradually relaxing, as she saw her own techniques reflected and validated in Mariel's work. When she left, she clutched a small canvas Mariel had given her, a sunrise painting that whispered of horizons yet unexplored. Evening brought Father Brennan's weekly call from his new assignment at a small parish in rural Ireland, as far from Vatican politics as geography would allow. How are you holding up? His voice carried warmth across the ocean. Scared about next week, Mariel admitted, but ready. Your parents would be proud. I think so too. After they hung up, Mariel pulled her mother's wooden cross from the chain around her neck, feeling its familiar weight. She thought about Casey, about the dozen other young survivors she had connected with through Dr. Chen's network, about the children still trapped in systems that preferred silence to justice. Her voice belonged to her now, fully and completely, and she was finally learning what that meant. Not just the power to speak truth, but the responsibility to help others find their voices too. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose courage over comfort. But tonight, in her sunlit apartment with its windows she could open wide, Mariel Santos slept peacefully, no longer silent, no longer afraid.